Thank you for being here, all of you. This is a pleasant surprise to see so many young people that we actually want to reach out to. Big books these days overwhelm the young, so don't be overwhelmed by the size of this book. Every page is worth reading, and unlike in his modest way, Mr. Malhotra says you don't need to read it from cover to cover. I actually have, and found it very enriching, and I'm sure all of you will. And it is an eye-opening book because it will help you locate some of the conversations we are having with such energy in the country. Now, Mr. Malhotra, thank you very much for speaking to me today, for making the time. It's a pleasure to be speaking to someone who at last is willing to submit their thesis for scrutiny, if I may put it like that. So it's always a sign that someone has done their research, they're sure about their facts, and they have the robustness intellectually to defend their thesis. And this is a very heavy thesis which you have presented, and I'm sure is going to spark a huge conversation. So without much ado, let me begin. Much of the concern you voiced in the book was in a way apparent just a few days ago when the Wall Street carried a full-page advertisement calling for the imposition of sanctions against certain Indians, 11 Indians, through the Magnitsky Act. This created a huge controversy because there were 11 names that were taken. But what we are now being told, according to government sources and others who were part of the group that actually funded this particular advertisement, was that the person behind, or one of the intellectual architects of this campaign, was the CEO of Devas Ramachandran Vishwanathan, who is a fugitive at large. So this ad was inspired by a fugitive in the WSJ. How do you read this? And who do you believe are the forces at work here, and what is their agenda?
Thank you very much. So, as we mentioned in this book, there are systems in place that are against the sovereignty of India and its civilization, and these people come from various points of view. They're not all the same point of view. Some are Indians who feel that they've been cheated, or they have grievances against the country and they haven't gotten justice. To be fair to them, they feel they haven't gotten justice, and they're going to an international authority, much like some Indian Rajas would go to the East India Company for help because they would feel that maybe this guy will give me justice. Now, you can argue that perhaps it's a good thing to do. I've talked to many of them, and they say, look, in India I didn't get justice, so I've gone to Harvard. And I say to them that maybe if you look at the track record of Harvard, whether they intervene in Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam in the name of bringing human rights and democracy, they destroying whatever existed there, the structures that existed there, in the name of creating better new structures. The new structures never happened. The old structures got destroyed. They left anarchy and a whole lot of nonsense and mess. So if you look at the track record, they haven't really succeeded in doing this anywhere else. Why would we trust them and bring them here? How do you know that they won't make it even worse for you? And the second point is that while there is injustice in India, social injustice in India, the US, people like Harvard and others, have not been able to repair the social justice in their own country. I mean, how can they export solutions to us? So, you know, for people to put out issues against Indians, you can find such issues 10 times over against, you know, Americans themselves, and they should be basically sorting their own thing out. I see the following. I see that Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, all these places, think tanks, the US Congress, Harvard, etc., are like a giant foil, and the people who feel injustice has been done, who have grievances want to reach out and hit out and get something from them because they feel that if I am enough of a victim, if I play the role of victim, they'll admit me, and so maybe they'll help me. So I see that that's what's going on. It's a combination of people who are victims, who feel that their own country didn't help them enough, and maybe somebody is a fugitive or somebody is an activist in some other sense. There are a lot of political groups in India that go to Harvard. Sugata Bose is based there, and he was an MP in Mamata Banerjee's party. So he is based, he's a very senior professor there. He brings all these kind of people there. Rahul Gandhi is interviewed and he gives a lot of talk against the Indian government, but he'd rather go there and do it. You see, I have no problem with all of this discussion happening within India. It should happen. But when you go to a foreign authority, then you are bringing in their agenda. You shouldn't think that they are some pure people who are, out there without any agenda of their own, and they're out there to generously help you. They've never done that in any other country that they intervene. So that's my perspective on why this is going on, and I would blame Indians also. I don't think that all Indians are very nice and easy and good people, and all Americans are bad people, and they're doing this to us. I don't believe in that. The United States has many segments, many different kinds of people, and you will find from the one extreme to the other extreme, like in India, you'll find many kinds of people. So basically, it's the Indians who have found allies in America, certain groups, to help them out, and so all sorts of things that are happening in India are a product of this sort of collaboration between grieved Indians who are victims and Americans who have this liberal idea that we're going to civilize the world, we're going to save humanity, even though they haven't saved their own people. So I see it that way.
It's interesting because how would you explain then the difference between what we're seeing now and what's happened in the past? Remember that India was on the wrong side of the Western, perhaps intellectual tradition. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, we were seen as being aligned to the Soviet bloc. And of course, there were people who were funding and collaborators here in India who were open to funds from the West to try and change the dominant narrative in the country. So how does that differ from the past? What's happening now?
So in the past, they didn't want India to slip too much into the Soviet camp. So that's the interference you're talking about. The CIA was here. In fact, one of the leaders who understood what I'm talking about better than anyone else was Indira Gandhi. I have to say that. Indira Gandhi took on Richard Nixon. She was very concerned about the CIA. She banned Ford Foundation. She banned Ford Foundation. She did a lot of things that were very nationalistic. So you can't say that this is some kind of a Hindutva project because she's nothing to do with Hindutva. She was just a very patriotic Indian who didn't like all this kind of nonsense happening. And she was very angry at Henry Kissinger, and she was angry at Nixon. All that stuff is well known. Now, in the present time, the United States has appreciated that India is a useful ally. I would use the word useful. It's not ally per se, like in the sense of England or Israel, but a useful ally. Useful in the sense that we can be a counter to China, we can be a counter to the expansion of Islam. Both of those are the big problems that the United States faces. But it's not India for sake of India. Indians somehow get mesmerized, get into a romantic thing that, maybe the Russians love us or maybe the Americans love us. The fact is that nobody loves us, they love themselves, and they love us if it's useful for that. We have to really stand on our own the way China has done. And so United States interventions in India have changed. From the earlier version, which was to subvert the Soviet influence, to a new version, which is partly to open the policies of the economy and bring in a floodgate of a whole lot of American technology and also American policies. Both technologies going at the elite level, corporate, and policies are going at the government level, also at the top. And educating a huge generation of people, young Indians, either directly from America or indirectly through professors who've been trained in America. So that's where the difference is. And the end game for the United States is to make India a good, thriving economy, a capitalist economy up to a point, but not another China. You see, a billion plus Chinese is bad enough competition. Having another billion plus economy also like that would be just devastating. So they don't want India to fall apart, because that would be like another Middle East kind of a thing, 100 times bigger. That would be very bad. If India fell apart, that would be bad for the Americans. And if India became another China the other way around, that would also be bad for the Americans. I often call it the mother-in-law syndrome, if I may be pardoned for that. Mother-in-law doesn't want that the couple fight and break up. That's not good for her. But she doesn't want that they come together so strong that they also defeat her. So it's like if they are too much together. I'm glad you liked my humor, because in many places I go, they say, oh no, sexist and whatever.
You'll be cancelled.
Yeah.
You'll be cancelled.
But I see that you can take humor also. So if they are too strong, that's a threat. But if they fall apart, there's no family left, that's also pretty bad. So this is the American mother-in-law syndrome. If India were to fall apart, it's bad for America. They don't want it. And if India were to be too much together, so that would be another China. They don't want that either. They don't want India to fall apart like the Middle East crisis, all these things happening and wars inside. And they don't want India to become another China, which is too strong, too together. So this is the dance of America between these two extremes. And this is one thing you have to keep in mind when you're trying to read them.
In your book, and it's very interesting, you write one of the ways that this is done, and let me quote you, is that seeds of social discord are being planted. Now let me quote you here. Mr. Malhotra and co-author Ms. Vishwanathan write, what is essential to explain is the way African Americans and Dalits are being brought together for this purpose, so that the latest shockwaves of racism in American society can be transported to India, unquote. In other words, what you're saying is that a parallel is being drawn between the black experience, the subversion of a particular cadre of society, and here in India with Dalits. And you talk in detail about how this is being done. My question is, if a group believes it has a historical grievance of being ill-treated, it does place its grievance in certain global context to create awareness. Now, is that what you believe is happening here, or is there something more insidious?
I think that's what's happening here. There are grievances. I sympathize with them. In fact, I've tried to reach out to these Harvard people. I've written to Suraj Yengde, their poster boy, for this Afro-Dalit movement. He's changed his hair to an afro, and he said, I'm a black, and it's kind of symbolically, brotherhood with the blacks. We heard of Bobby Jindal, who was trying to be white, and now we have another kind of person who's trying to be black. I mean, there is opportunism both ways. So I've tried to reach out to him a few times saying, I'm actually critiquing your book, Suraj Yengde. He's a young man, very charismatic, very powerful speaker, and they really like this kind of guy at Harvard. He's an Indian Dalit. And I've said, can we sit down and talk about how all the issues you're raising can be addressed in the Indian context? You don't need Harvard, and how Harvard is using you. They're using you because you're a useful person for doing all this, and they're not going to, at the end of the day, help you. You'll just make a lot of noise and help them out. And maybe the creamy layer, people like you, will enjoy the good life at Harvard, but your people in India are not going to get any benefit out of it. So I've tried, but not been able to get any response, any interest on their part. So I think this is correct. The people like that from India. There are Kashmir separatists, by the way. There are Khalistanis. So it's not just the Dalits. There are all kinds of people here who land up there. And when they have these South Asian conferences, they feature all kinds of things. They talk about, Indian army. I mean, that is the place you go and express your complaints against India, and you get a very good hearing. And the counter view, they have never invited. Now, if there is a panel on army atrocities in Kashmir, then the right thing would have been to bring an army person also on the panel to give a response. If there is a panel discussion where Suraj Jengde says that Brahmins are criminal tribe, a criminal caste, criminal, he keeps using it many times, okay, and he says things like family should be dismantled because family is a Brahmanical conspiracy to transmit oppressiveness into the next generation. When he makes these extreme cases, they should bring in people who are experts from the opposing point of view, and that would be, I would respect Harvard for doing that. But those people are cancelled. So this one-sidedness of Harvard is troubling.
So let me ask you this, because you have submitted a response through your book, and the chapter is called A Response History of Indian Social Organization, where you break down or critique his thesis and say that it has deficiencies. Can you explain for our audience that is watching, what are the critical differences that you believe haven't been factored in when making this sort of link between the blacks in America and the Dalits here in India?
Well, you know, when you talk about racism in America and they map it onto Indian Dalits, not only Dalits but also minorities, the equivalent would be if Indian minorities were people brought from another continent, brought by us from another continent as slaves and enslaved and oppressed. But Dalits are, I mean, neither Dalits were brought nor Muslims or Christians were forced and brought here as slaves. And that would be the equivalent thing. Also, when we talk about the oppressiveness that the whites had, the laws were very different. The laws of racism were very different. We haven't had that kind of the argument they give is that from Vedic times, Dalits have been slaves. This is the kind of argument being given. But the facts are very different. They were, prior to the Islamic period, if you look at it, there were Dalit, there were Shudra dynasties of kings. There were many professions where the lower caste were, what are today called lower caste, were quite prosperous. There were metallurgists, there were textile workers, there were agriculturists, and India was a very prosperous country. So when we look at the history of world economics, Cambridge University Press, history of world economics and world prosperity, until around 1800 or so, India and China were far richer than the Western world. So when you say India was so rich, as per Western documentation, their own British documentation, when India was so rich, it could not have been the case that 2 or 5% people who are Brahmins are controlling all the wealth. That was not the case. They are not even allowed to control the wealth. So it had to be the masses. And even Dharampal in the 1800s, he cites the British records that until the 1800s, the British themselves write that the average Indian is better fed, better clothed than his counterpart in England. So there was prosperity among the masses. And he also looks at the composition of students in a Pathshala, and he looks at what caste they came from. Majority of them were lower caste by today. So the level of education given to these people was there. It was vocational for agriculture purposes, for whatever the profession of that family was, they were educated for that, and they were doing well. So I don't believe that they were always consistently poor. That is not the case. That history doesn't bear that out. And nor is it that this was sanctioned, because if you really want to look at Varna, which is not the same as Jati and which is not the same as caste, Varna, in the Varna system, a Brahmin is not allowed to have wealth. Brahmin is not allowed to have wealth. So today's Brahmins are not being Brahmins. I mean, if the ones who have wealth are not being Brahmins. It is not the fault of the system. It is that they're in violation of the system. Because Brahmins who accumulate wealth, nor is a Brahmin allowed to have political power. That is a Kshatriya's job. So the separation of political power with Kshatriyas, and the Kshatriya is not allowed to have wealth. The Kshatriya is not allowed to become a billionaire. And nor can he become a Brahmin and become a super intellectual type. So the Brahmins controlled intellectual capital, the Kshatriyas political capital and legal capital, and the Vaishyas economic capital. So it's a separation of capital, and also it is not by birth, because that's an old debate we've had. People have said it's by birth. But all throughout history, people have also said it's not by birth, and they've challenged it. So you've always had this back and forth going on with people from various origins and various births, challenging and moving up and moving down. So Suraj Yengde has got this very fossilized, fixed, all those guys are bad, all these guys are good, all the Brahmins are oppressors. This is kind of too extreme.
And you mentioned that there is an attempt to therefore dismantle structures.
Yes.
As we know them. So let me just quickly read out a few things that Suraj Yengde just wrote a few days back in a newspaper and just give you a little bit of a primer. The fact is, in your book, you write that the whole idea is to dismantle Hinduism, which is the original sinner, and then the political, perhaps, expression of it, Hindutva.
Yes.
So Mr. Yengde writes, given that the RSS has not actively tried to abolish caste from society, the hierarchical Varna structure is still sanctified by its cadre. The sworn Hindus do not challenge the atrocities against Dalits. When cases such as Hathras happen, the honesty of Dr. Bhagwat's words ring hollow. They are merely a side talk by the RSS trying to shadow BJP and reiterate that they're still the ones who call the shots, unquote. Now, Mr. Malhotra, one might disagree with Mr. Yengde, but can it be denied that this desire to unite Hindu society does not find resonance among some who believe there are Hindus who cannot overcome their prejudices against the scheduled castes, tribes, etc.? So, is Yengde's narrative divorced from reality?
So, first of all, I don't want to defend RSS because they should defend themselves.
Sure.
I mean, I have many friends who are in the RSS. I also disagree with some of them on certain matters. I also support them and I feel they've done amazing work. But as far as defending their policy and their practice regarding caste, I think it's for them to do. But what I've heard them say, they are against the caste system. Today, they are against the caste system. And they know it weakens Hindu society. So for that reason, they want to get rid of those kind of biases. In fact, a lot of the caste Brahmin type people disagree with them on that very basis. So I don't think his facts are correct, but they have to defend that. Now, as far as is the society divided? Yes. Is there oppression? Yes. But that is true of every society. There is not a single civilization in the world today, even a homogeneous society like Japan, certainly not Russia, certainly not the Middle East, certainly not France, any European country, United States. There is no major country in the world which can say that there is no social hierarchy, that there is no social oppression. That is how it is. So one could say all societies, all civilizations, all religions have failed, all countries have failed, dismantle everything. Then what happens? What happens is you have anarchy, you have a vacuum of power, a vacuum of any system, and this is a recipe for irresponsible people to take over the vacuum. If India fell apart because all the structures were destroyed, it is not that there'll suddenly be Dalits running the country. It will be that there'll be mischief makers from our neighborhood coming and taking over, and the Dalits will also become slaves like anybody else. So if you destroy each other because somebody says to X that Y is your enemy, and they have oppressed you, you should overthrow them. It is not that X will start becoming the ruler, you'll destroy each other. The Marxist dialectic says that you have to, the thesis should be combated with an antithesis, and the two should have a war until both are destroyed so that a new order emerges. But in reality, Marxism has succeeded in creating destruction, never succeeded in creating a new order. They have no experience. They have never proposed. When you've destroyed the structures, how will you put up a new structure? They have no idea. Suraj Yengde, if you ask him, okay, let's say you're successful, you demolish all the structures of Indian society. Okay, now you have anarchy. So what's your plan next morning? If today you achieve that, next morning, what are you going to do? How are you going to run this society? See, this is the problem that Taliban had when they took over Afghanistan. They were very good at destroying and kicking out a structure. But when they had to suddenly run the country, they had no experience. They did not know what the hell to do. So now they're bringing everybody back saying, okay, now please help us run the country because we have no experience. So we may have a situation like that if the Suraj Yengdes were successful.
This is interesting because in America, of course, there was this big conversation after the death of a black individual 2.5 years ago, where certain city councils said the time has come because of institutionalized racism to dismantle the police force.
Yes.
And they didn't quite have an answer of what would replace it to
Right.
bring about. But just to take off from where you left off, you talk about CRT or critical race theory, and you say it has its origins in Marxism. And Marxism hasn't been able to sort of supply the answers to a lot of the questions that you sort of proposed. How can cancel culture, which is an intrinsic part of CRT, it is one of the reasons why you claim CRT militates against classical liberalism. How big a concern is this on Indian campuses, Delhi University, for example, which are, at least on paper, meant to be upholding inclusivity and a diversity of views? A colleague of mine comes from JNU, where right now, if you belong to the other side, so to speak, ideologically, you are considered somebody who doesn't have an intellectual tradition backing your point of view. So how do you militate against, for example,
So I think
cancel culture?
cancel culture has existed in India. Cancel culture has existed in the United States. Basically, cancel culture says that those who disagree, rather than debating them, you should cancel them, throw them out. Now, this is totally contrary to the Indian ethos, which says do a purva paksha, which means you study the other respectfully, invite him for debate. Indians have a long history of argumentation, of engaging other people in a civil manner, non-violent, peaceful manner, purely intellectual manner, with rules of debate, you see. So on the one hand, they are saying this old civilization is no good, because everything should be dismantled. But on the other hand, this is a civilization that given the world many great things, including the idea that you should listen to other people and you should invite them for debate. So cancel culture is a new phenomenon in India. It's also a relatively new phenomenon on American campuses, because till recently, you know, the US campuses, when they were liberal, they were truly liberal. Nowadays, when say liberal, it's just a name, but they're not being truly liberal. Cancel culture is the most illiberal thing you can imagine. And the campuses have become ideological centers rather than free thinking centers. So rather than giving them opposing points of view so that the kids can decide for themselves, they should be comfortable in a world of complexity. They'll be living in a complex world, not a world where everybody's like them. And if they're going to live in a complex world, they should know that I have this view, somebody has that view, maybe he's partly right, maybe I'm partly right. That's complexity, and they should be encouraged. So people who disagree with Harvard, rather than being cancelled, should be brought in. And I have no problem if I'm sitting there and there's all these other people against me and we are having an amicable debate. I have no problem if the whole class is against me or for me, or if there's two people for me. I have no problem with that. But I do have a problem that they don't even want to hear opposing points of view. So this cancel culture is a kind of, it's self-defeating, because on the one hand you're against structures of oppression, but this cancel culture is itself a structure of oppression.
Of course, there's a startling bit of hypocrisy and contradiction there, but you're seeming to sort of link it with CRT, but India has had a large number of groups, for example, that have got irritated by movies or books that have been written, and intellectuals who have espoused points of views, even in the past. So, and you sort of say it's alien to Indian culture, but as we know, even under previous Congress governments, for example, there were hundreds of instances of where movies were not allowed to be screened, or
Yes.
books that were not released. So,
Yes.
are we being a little superficial? Because cancel culture seems to have, I mean, there was an emergency, for God's sakes, in this country. That was the biggest.
That was the cancel culture.
Biggest,
Big one. Yes.
biggest example,
Yes.
and legitimized by the courts
Yes.
themselves. So how does that work?
So I think modern India has this problem. I mean, I do not consider that whether it's the BJP government or the Congress government, I don't absolve them of this problem. I think the British had this problem. I mean, the British would beat up all the, freedom fighters and all that stuff. They killed some of them. I mean, there's Jallianwala Bagh was a peaceful protest. I mean, come on, that's cancel culture. You shoot those guys. I mean, that's pretty bad. Yeah. So this has been going on. And this is a kind of a product of modernity. I think this is a product of modernity that I would say that more traditional societies, I do a lot of work with Native Americans. Native Americans had a very free society. I mean, they would have a council of people, women, men, and they would all speak up, and nobody's got kicked out for some opposing point of view. Somehow in modernity, this started in the West and it's everywhere, the intolerance and kind of an absoluteness of truth that some people control became kind of prevalent. And media, I mean, sorry because you're from media, but media kind of played this role because it's sort of the gatekeeper. And so as the gatekeeper of what will go out and what won't go out, it has also kind of homogenized the discourse in some ways. So I would, and we thought when social media came that this will change cancel culture because now anybody can do this. So for a while, social media was the antidote to cancel culture. But guess what happened? The algorithms are now running the social media. The algorithms are canceling. It's not Mark Zuckerberg deciding that you will be cancelled and you will be promoted. He doesn't have to do that. He's got these algorithms which can do the job of 100 million censoring human beings. These algorithms have been fed certain criteria of truth. So now, for instance, if I say swastika, the algorithm says it's Nazism. And I cannot argue that in my tradition it doesn't mean that. My tradition has a different meaning. During COVID, many of my videos were cancelled because I was advocating Ayurvedic treatments, and over there the idea of Ayurvedic treatment was considered fake news. So it was cancelled. So who gets to decide? The only thing they tell you is violates community standards. So you violated community standards, there's no human being available. Finally, when you do get to a human being at YouTube or Facebook, they will say, sir, we don't know because this is algorithm. Algorithm is the devata that is cancelling people now.
Now coming to Harvard, which you just talked about, which you believe is in many ways not just a symbol but also a laboratory for unleashing these snakes in the Ganga. Now, this is a dramatic exposition when you link an institution, and we began by speaking about it. But in some ways, many people there might think that you are being hyperbolic and political, and if someone doesn't agree with you, you've sort of typecast them. You've called them a snake. There are other examples of people being called anti-nationals here in India. So how do you address those skeptics who will say, no, Rajiv Malhotra is very upset because we don't call him for a few debates now in Harvard, and he's therefore gone off on a tangent, and he's now saying that whatever we do is engineered towards the breakup of India and so on and so forth.
Okay, so Harvard has such a lot of extreme admonishment and attacks on India, they can hardly complain that I'm doing the same to them. I mean, the power they have is 1,000 times or many thousands of times more than mine. And if they are wielding this power and constantly able to come up with the standard discourse on Indian history, they have an idea on this Aryan theory, which is a very standard Harvard discourse. And you can go on arguing against it all you want. They just accuse you and blame you and call you names, but they're not going to invite such people. So it's not just a problem with me personally, it's a problem with the whole system that is a contrarian system. I disagreed when they cancelled Subramaniam Swamy. I mean, I don't agree with him on all things, but they fired him from Harvard. He was an economics professor. His specialty was comparative study of Indian and Chinese economy. It had nothing to do with Islam. But he happened to make a statement in Mumbai where he said that Indian Muslims had Hindu ancestors. Now, okay, if you disagree with it, you can invite him and give him a contrarian view and debate him and see what the truth is. You don't cancel him from his economics class. It has nothing to do with it. And in many ways, it makes sense because if they didn't have Hindu ancestors, then who were their ancestors? Their ancestors would have to be Arabs, which the Muslims don't want to. The Muslims don't want that to say that our ancestors were Arabs or Turks. They are Indians. So if they were Indians, then who were they? I mean, it's not a totally outrageous hypothesis. You can say maybe it's false, or maybe it's true, maybe it's sometimes true, in some cases it's false, but it's something subject for debate. You don't have to fire an economics professor. So I can give you many such examples where they have done this kind of thing. So it's hardly fair criticism that if I'm taking them on, it's something unreasonable, because people who have so much power and so much absolute power and who've used it in this kind of a way need to be criticized. And you know, I like to take on an issue, I like to take on the most powerful examples, not the marginal examples. Because if I am to make my case on the hegemony of Western study of India, then taking on some minor college here, there, some minor professor would not make my case. My case is made by taking on the most powerful. They have all the resources to come back and to debate me and to prove me wrong, and I'm challenging them to do that in a civil manner. And if they can do it, and if they can correct me, I'll correct myself. I'll put out a new edition and make all the corrections if they can find flaws. So this means I put myself up against a very high standard, and I like to do that, because if I'm right even part of my points, if I made 100 points, even if many of them are right, it's such a big deal. It would call for a major overhaul. And my belief is that I'm right pretty much all the time, or in all of these, because I've done my research. So I have raised the bar by criticizing the highest, most mighty people for a reason, and I challenge them to come back.
So let me ask you, because you write this, and I'm going to wind up in just the next 5 minutes so the floor can be opened up. You write, we discovered something far more worrisome. China's inroads into Harvard are also a gateway for it to penetrate India with influence and subversion, unquote. Tell us about how this is happening.
So there's two parts to this. China has infiltrated Harvard is a story in its own right. China's infiltration of Harvard has now become known to the FBI. They've gone and arrested a few professors. This has happened over a quarter century. And only in the last few years, when the US started becoming suspicious of China, they started looking at where are their footprints, where are their spies, and they realized that in many American think tanks, in some of the corporate R&D centers, and in places like Harvard, they've brought lots of people and they've infiltrated. Exactly the opposite of Indian billionaires who have given the money and let Harvard call the shots, and Harvard brainwash Indians. In the case of Chinese, the philanthropists have given money, but they've required Harvard to follow certain guidelines that China has established. So you cannot use Chinese money and affiliations and use it to criticize their policy on Tibet or the Uyghurs or their policy in Hong Kong or Taiwan. You can't do that, not allowed at Harvard. So that is the first part, that Chinese presence in places like Harvard. Second part is that they've used this presence to get into India, because Harvard is now in India in a big way. Harvard is in Mumbai, they have a center in Delhi. They are in active collaboration with Piramal on public health and so on. And Chinese influence is there. Chinese are very present in Ashoka University, the China Studies Center in Ashoka University. I've had some nice conversations with people who are involved in India's security, kind of intelligence kind of people, and they are also agreeing that there are a lot of red flags about the China studies going on in certain places in India. But most of all, it's the data gathering. The Chinese equipment with photographs and videos and with facial recognition are like monitoring devices all over India. So China is big in capturing AI, what's very useful for AI, which is big data, capturing data from Indian sources, capturing data automatically, and also from various Indian databases. So a lot of the examples we have given in this book concern the data mining of India that China is doing.
This is a table on page 324 where you talk about the Harvard University's ethics, and then if you just turn the page, we come to this big chart, and Mr. Malhotra was talking about these charts. Indian billionaires, Harvard, Vishwaguru, and Breaking India 2.0, where he talks about, of course, And he adds this caveat that, look, successful Indian businessmen have funded Harvard University. Obviously, you don't attribute, malify the motives, but you do say that they ought to now seriously review or at least investigate what their money is actually turning out. Now, why do you say this?
More than the money, it's their family name. Because if I were Lakshmi Mittal, then imagine Lakshmi Mittal and family, South Asia Institute at Harvard. So a person stands up and makes all this, spits out all this stuff, and on the back, the banner says Lakshmi Mittal and family, South Asia Institute. And he's standing there, he's introduced, his visiting card says he's a professor there, and the conference is named after that family institute, it's their annual conference. You know, I would be very concerned that in my name all this stuff is going on. Sooner or later, people in India are going to find out. It's not going to remain a secret forever. And when they find out, are they going to be upset? If I were in their shoes, I would have an independent annual report. I would bring, like you bring auditors every year to check it out. And their job is to raise red flags. They're not harming you by saying that, Mr. Industrialist, these are some issues in your factory, these are issues in your books. They're actually helping you. Like you go for a physical fitness test and the cardiologist says, do this, do that, here are some problems. He's not trying to harm you, he's trying to help you. So in the same way, what we are doing is a civilizational audit on behalf of these industrialists, saying that as far as Indian civilization is concerned, I mean, you guys are doing a lot of good in India and you're trying to do good in Harvard, but frankly, in your name and with your money, are aligned certain speakers, certain thinkers, certain type of dissertations, certain resolutions, certain political movements which are not very good for India, and you should take a look. And if you like it, fine. It's not my money. I have no right to stop them. I'm not trying to stop them. I'm simply raising an issue. But if you want to continue doing this, continue doing it, but let the people of India know that this is what you want to do. On the other hand, if you're concerned, then do something about it.
Well, that's what my final question to you is about. Look, universities are guilty of the same selectivism as individuals. They have their own biases too, as you've now sort of expounded over the last half an hour. There is a robust left ecosystem, but the intellectual right hasn't been able to sort of create its own Harvard, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
So why crib about it? Let's focus on the solution, which is to create your own ideologically aligned Bharatiya Vedic Harvard.
Absolutely. I would love to see, and I've said this for 20 years, and I would be available in any way to help. I would love to see a Vedic liberal arts university in India. There are these 64 kalas that were taught in the Indian system, you know, everything from debate and philosophy and, you know, the Dharma Shastras, the Artha Shastras, the Natya Shastras, all of that. Those are the liberal arts of India. And India was the Harvard of the time, if you will, because people would come from China, the brilliant scholars from Cambodia, Vietnam, all over these countries would come to India and study this and take it back. I mean, the Chinese accept this, that India civilized China in a big way. The Japanese accept that. I used to have a friend in Columbia University who later moved to Harvard, a Japanese guy called Ruchi Abe, who wrote, he knew what the kind of work I'm doing like 25 years ago. So he gifted me a book called Weaving the Mantra by Ruchi Abe, which is a big, huge book, and it gives the history of Japanese culture and its debt to India. Language, iconography, martial arts, so much thinking that came from not just religion and Buddhism, but so many things that came from there. So, you know, India has been the liberal arts Vishwa Guru at one time for Eurasia, much of Eurasia. Okay. But today, we are a consumer, not a producer of knowledge. And it's not enough to be emotional and be bombastic and have slogans and knock down this and have a riot that. I'm against that. I don't like it when the Hindu right is basically about shouting, screaming down other people, replacing one kind of a dogma and cancel culture with another. I think we need to intelligent people, and this book is a manual, it's a training manual to help you do that. Please, if you want to do a 1-semester course on this, I'll be happy to come and teach it if you want me to do that, because you need to learn how to argue, what to argue, how to debate in a very civil manner. We need to produce people such that when you are facing unreasonable statements from the other side, you are either shouting down and saying, I'll do this or that to you, threats and all that. You should say, give me time, have a neutral, honest moderator, and let's debate, and let's be straightforward. If you produce enough people like that, the victory will be far greater for you, far more spectacular, and those people will run because they will not be able to stand your logic and your clarity. That's what we need to do, rather than all this counter cancel culture, which I think is a bad idea.
It's a very good point that Professor has made here. It's a very, very important point. Let me also tell you that there have been others who have argued this point in the past. Conrad Elst comes to mind immediately. Let's intellectualize the right, as he had argued in one of his books about 25 years ago that I had happened to read. So it's very nice to hear the same sentiments from Mr. Malhotra, and of course through this book, his co-author, both of them, Ms. Vishwanathan, who has joined us here on link. Thank you very much for watching this. Thank you very much.